Ravenhurst Manor loomed before James Blackwood, a skeletal silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its darkened windows stared like hollow eyes, promising only decay and forgotten sorrows. He had come to claim an inheritance, a surprising legacy from a great-uncle he had never met, a man whose existence had been a mere footnote in distant family lore. The wrought iron gates, rusted and groaning, swung open with a reluctant shriek, a sound that seemed to tear through the oppressive stillness of the evening. A chill, deeper than the autumn air, settled upon James, a premonition clinging to him like an unwelcome shroud as he stepped onto the weed-choked drive. The journey had been long, the news unexpected, and the destination, now materialized, was profoundly unsettling. The solicitor, a Mr. Alistair Croft, had delivered the news with a somber formality that did little to ease James's apprehension. His voice, dry as old parchment, detailed the extent of the bequest, the entire Ravenhurst estate, its sprawling grounds, and the brooding manor itself. A fortune by any measure. Yet there was a peculiar stipulation, a condition that felt plucked from the pages of a Gothic novel. To truly inherit, James was required to spend one complete night within the manor's ancient walls, from the moment dusk settled until the first rays of dawn broke the horizon. Only then, after enduring this solitary vigil, would the final papers be signed and the estate legally become his. Before parting, Mr. Croft had offered a final cryptic piece of advice, his gaze flickering with an emotion James couldn't quite decipher, perhaps fear, perhaps pity. "There is one thing, Mr. Blackwood," he'd said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "a small matter perhaps, but one I am obligated to mention. Just don't go into the forgotten room." James had managed a polite, if somewhat strained smile. A forgotten room? The notion seemed absurd, a relic of a more superstitious age. He was a practical man, grounded in the realities of the modern world, not one to be swayed by old wives' tales or fanciful warnings. He was here for property, not phantoms. However, as James pushed open the massive oak front door and stepped into the cavernous, dust-filled hall, his initial skepticism began to waver, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. The air inside was thick, stagnant, heavy with the scent of mildew and ages of neglect. Silence, profound and absolute, pressed in on him, yet it felt charged, expectant. Cobwebs, intricate and undisturbed, festooned the high ceilings and draped over portraits whose subjects stared out with faded, mournful eyes. He told himself it was merely the atmosphere of an old, deserted house, nothing more. But a deeper instinct whispered that something was profoundly wrong, that a presence, ancient and unseen, was aware of his arrival, watching him. He located what appeared to be a library, its shelves lined with decaying tomes, their leather bindings cracked and their pages yellowed with time. Dust motes danced in the weak beam of his flashlight, the only illumination he dared to use beyond the few sputtering candles he'd found. He settled into a threadbare armchair, its velvet worn smooth by generations long past, attempting to distract himself with a book. But the words on the page refused to coalesce into meaning, his attention constantly snagged by the oppressive atmosphere of the room. The shadows in the corners seemed to deepen, to writhe with a life of their own, playing tricks on his tired eyes, hinting at forms that weren't truly there, lurking just beyond perception. As the grandfather clock in the hall laboriously chimed midnight, each resonant strike echoing through the silent house like a hammer blow against his nerves, the manor seemed to stir from its slumber. It was no longer just a collection of stone and wood. It felt alive, breathing around him with a malevolent patience. The ancient timbers of the house groaned and settled, sounds too deliberate to be attributed solely to age or the shifting of foundations. Upstairs, distinct creaks echoed, the sound of slow, heavy footsteps pacing a hallway, a deliberate tread that sent shivers down James's spine. He held his breath, straining to listen, every sense on high alert, trying to convince himself he was alone, though the conviction was rapidly fading. The portraits lining the corridor walls, their subjects rendered in oils darkened by centuries, seemed to take on a more sinister aspect in the deepening gloom. Their painted eyes, fixed and unblinking, appeared to follow his every movement, a silent, collective gaze that felt both judgmental and malevolent. He could almost feel their cold scrutiny on his skin, the weight of their disapproval pressing down on him. He tried to dismiss it as a figment of his overactive imagination, exacerbated by the isolation and the eerie tales implicitly woven into the fabric of such an old, imposing place. He needed to remain rational, to resist the encroaching dread that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Then the whispers began. At first they were almost inaudible, a faint sighing like the rustle of dry leaves, easily mistaken for the wind finding its way through unseen cracks in the ancient structure. But the night outside was unnervingly still, the air heavy and unmoving, holding its breath. The whispers persisted, growing in clarity, soft, sibilant voices that seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves, seeping through the decaying plaster. "Let us out," they pleaded, a chorus of faint, sorrowful entreaties that slithered into his ears. "We are trapped, so long trapped." A profound, icy dread gripped James. This was no longer imagination, this was something else, something terrifyingly real, and the house was indeed speaking to him. An irresistible compulsion seized James, drawing him from the relative safety of the library, a place that now felt tainted by the encroaching unease. The whispers acted like an invisible current, tugging him forward, their plaintive cries echoing not just in the air but seemingly within the hollow chambers of his own mind. He found himself standing, his limbs moving with a strange autonomy, as if guided by an external will he could not resist. He stepped out into the grand, shadowy hallway, where the temperature had noticeably dropped, the cold biting at his exposed skin. The air here felt dense, cloying, making each breath a conscious, laborious effort. His footsteps, loud and solitary, reverberated through the oppressive silence. He followed the intensifying whispers down a long, narrow corridor he hadn't noticed upon his initial exploration of the ground floor, a passage that seemed to have materialized from the shadows. It stretched away into an inky blackness, a gaping maw in the ancient architecture of the manor, promising only deeper horrors. The portraits that adorned these particular walls were more disturbing than those he had seen before. Their subjects' faces were contorted into expressions of unspeakable terror, their eyes wide with a madness that seemed to leap from the canvas and claw at his sanity. The air grew heavier with each step, saturated with the cloying scent of damp earth, rotting wood, and an indefinable ancient mustiness. At the furthest end of this unnerving passage, a single door stood apart from the others, an ominous sentinel guarding unspeakable secrets. It was constructed of thick, dark timber, heavily reinforced with rusted iron bands that crisscrossed its surface like crude sutures. Multiple heavy bolts, encrusted with age and grime, secured it shut, and thick, corroded chains were looped through sturdy brackets, further emphasizing its forbidden nature. The wood itself was deeply scarred with long, frantic scratch marks, as if some desperate creature or creatures had clawed at it relentlessly from the other side, or perhaps from this side, trying to keep something unimaginable contained. This, James knew with a chilling certainty, was the Forgotten Room. Mr. Croft's warning, "Just don't go into the Forgotten Room," reverberated in his ears. The chorus of whispers now seemed to emanate directly from behind the scarred door, and simultaneously, from within the confines of his own skull, a terrifying internal echo. They were louder now, more desperate, a cacophony of pleading, tormenting voices. "Open the door," they implored, their tones shifting from sorrowful to demanding. "Release us. You must help us." His hand, trembling uncontrollably, reached for the topmost bolt, the cold metal sending a shock through his system. A war raged within him, the solicitor's grave warning, his own ingrained rationality, versus the overwhelming, almost hypnotic compulsion to uncover the mystery. The lure was too powerful. With a grating screech of metal against metal, he slid the first bolt free. With each subsequent bolt drawn back, the sound echoed like a pronouncement of doom through the silent, watchful manor. The rusted metal shrieked in protest under the strain, a sound that set James's teeth on edge and sent fresh waves of icy apprehension coursing through his veins. The heavy chains, their ancient purpose now negated, clattered to the cold stone floor with a deafening clang, the noise seeming to awaken something deeper, something more malevolent within the house. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence that followed, each beat a countdown to an unknown horror. For a fleeting moment, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the tarnished doorknob, a final chance to retreat, to heed the warnings. A blast of frigid air, impossibly cold and carrying the fetid odor of the grave, rushed out from the open doorway, extinguishing his flickering candle in an instant and plunging him into near-total darkness. The air was thick with the cloying stench of decay, of ancient dust undisturbed for centuries, and of something else, something indescribably vile that hinted at long-forgotten suffering and unspeakable acts. The void beyond the threshold was absolute, a blackness so profound that it seemed to absorb all light, a palpable entity that pressed against him, suffocating and cold. He fumbled for his flashlight, its beam cutting a weak swath, but even its powerful light seemed diminished, swallowed by the Stygian gloom. From the impenetrable depths of the room, shapes began to coalesce, to detach themselves from the consuming darkness like nightmares taking physical form. They were tall, impossibly gaunt, their forms shadowy and distorted, barely recognizable as having once been human, now twisted into parodies of life. They drifted forward with an unnatural, silent grace, their movements fluid and terrifyingly purposeful, closing the distance between them and their unwilling visitor. Empty sockets, or what seemed like them, fixed upon James, and though they possessed no discernible features, he felt the intensity of their malevolent gaze, a hunger that transcended physical need, feasting on his terror. Terror, stark and absolute, seized James Blackwood, paralyzing him where he stood, a fly caught in an ancient spectral web. He tried to cry out, to recoil, to slam the dreadful door shut and seal away the horror, but his limbs refused to obey his frantic commands, his voice trapped in his constricted throat, a silent scream lost in the abyss. The door, as if moved by an unseen, malicious hand, swung closed behind him with a resounding, final thud, the click of the ancient latch sealing his fate within the darkness. The disembodied whispers escalated into a chorus of inhuman wails, a vortex of sound that swirled around him. The last thing James saw was his own face, contorted in terror, reflected in the void, staring back at him.